At the heart of Rome's earliest constitutional conflict lay a distinction that was not economic, but civic. Mommsen identifies a foundational divide, not between rich and poor, but between those with political personhood and those without. On one side stood the burgesses, the patricians, full citizens who held religious authority, political voice, and access to public office. On the other, the non-burghers, inhabitants of Rome who, though free, though resident, though often obligated to military service, were excluded from sovereignty. These non-burghers were not foreigners in the traditional sense. Many had Latin origins. Some were descended from manumitted slaves. Others were migrants from conquered communities, brought under Roman power but not welcomed into its civic core. What defined them was not lineage, but legal exclusion. They lacked access to the curiae, could not serve in priesthoods, and had no voice in the assemblies that ratified law or elected magistrates. Mommsen is explicit. This was not the result of conquest or punishment. It was structural. The Roman polity was designed from the outset as a closed civic corporation. Citizenship in its fullest sense was not conferred by presence or usefulness, but by ancestry, ritual standing, and inherited right. And yet, the non-burghers lived within the city's walls. They farmed Roman land, served in Roman legions, and paid Roman dues. They were part of the Roman economy, part of its military apparatus, but not part of its political structure. Their legal standing was that of tolerated insiders, essential but unrecognized. This was not sustainable. The very success of Rome's expansion, its conquest of Latin neighbors, its absorption of outsiders, meant that the number of non-burghers grew. And with them, so too did the contradiction, a city claiming civic order, yet withholding its privileges from those who sustained it. Mommsen sees in this division the early fault line of Roman constitutional evolution. The problem was not personal inequality, but institutional exclusion, and the state, as it stood, offered no mechanism for inclusion. The plebs would not remain politically invisible forever, but in their origins, they were not a class demanding more. They were a population demanding recognition. They began not as a class, but as a residue. The plebeians, plebs in the Roman vocabulary, were not originally defined by poverty, rebellion, or even solidarity. They were defined by absence. Excluded from the political and religious structure of the Roman state, they existed alongside the patricians, but not within the constitutional order that governed them. Mommsen is careful in his definition. The plebs were not slaves nor foreigners. They were, in many cases, landowners, merchants, and soldiers. They were economically diverse and often militarily indispensable. Yet they remained without jus honorum, the right to hold public office, or jus sacrorum, the right to participate in state religion. Their marginalization was not one of capacity, but of law. And so, out of this exclusion, a new political body began to take shape, not officially, not yet legally, but socially and culturally. The plebs began to act as a collective, not because they were originally designed to, but because shared exclusion forced shared identity. What Rome had inadvertently created was a parallel civic population, one that had its own customs, its own internal cohesion, and soon, its own demands. This was not yet class conflict in the modern sense. It was status conflict embedded in a rigid constitutional framework. The patricians, meanwhile, did not view the plebeians as rivals. They viewed them as dependents, as necessary auxiliaries in war and economy, but not as equals in governance. This assumption, that participation required dissent, would be challenged by the very structure it tried to preserve. Mommsen sees this moment as pivotal. The emergence of the plebs was not a social movement. It was the byproduct of systemic exclusion. It was Rome's constitutional rigidity that gave rise to political innovation. The state had drawn a line around citizenship, and in doing so, it had drawn the shape of its own opposition. As long as the plebeians were denied a role within the official apparatus, they would create a role outside it. What began as absence would soon become autonomy. No structure, however orderly, can endure long when its foundations shift. And in early Rome, those foundations were land, labor, and debt. Mommsen points to the increasing strain between patricians and plebeians not simply as a political problem, but as a material one. The plebs were drawn into Rome's wars, conscripted to fight in campaigns that expanded Roman territory and enriched its ruling class. But when the soldiers returned, they found the land they had fought for concentrated in patrician hands, and their own plots diminished, lost, or encumbered by debt. The Roman economy, still primitive and unmonetized in parts, relied heavily on personal obligation. Debt was not abstract, it was a legal and physical bond. The system of nexum, a form of debt bondage, allowed creditors to seize the person of the debtor as surety. The line between citizen and chattel blurred quickly under the weight of default. For the plebeians, the contradiction was acute. They bore arms for the republic, yet had no voice in its deliberations. They paid taxes, yet reaped little from public land. And increasingly, they were imprisoned or enslaved not by enemies, but by fellow Romans. Mommsen is unambiguous. This crisis was not incidental. It was structural. The same legal framework that protected patrician property rendered plebeian distress invisible to the state. The result was growing unrest, not episodic, but persistent. What began as individual grievance evolved into collective tension. The state, as constituted, had no mechanism for redress. The comitia curiata remained closed to the plebs. The Senate did not represent them. The king, if he still held office, could act only within the bounds of tradition. There was no magistrate, no court, no formal process through which the grievances of the plebeians could enter the civic discourse. And so, as Mommsen observes, social crisis became constitutional pressure. Rome was not on the brink of collapse, but it was pressed to evolve. The tensions over land and debt were not just economic. They became the catalysts for political innovation. The state would be forced to adapt or fracture. In this way, plebeian unrest was not rebellion against the Roman system. It was an insistence that the system recognize its own contradictions. The Roman constitution did not collapse under pressure, it bent. And when it bent, it produced one of its most radical and enduring creations, the tribunate of the plebs. Mommsen recounts the event not as myth, but as institutional rupture. The plebeians, driven by legal exclusion, military obligation, and economic exploitation, reached a point where withdrawal became their only form of power. They left the city, not in revolt, but in refusal. They marched to the Sacred Mount, outside the formal boundaries of Rome, and established themselves as a separate body. This act, later known as the First Secession, was not merely a protest. It was a constitutional provocation. By removing themselves from the civic body, the plebeians threatened to form one of their own. And in doing so, they forced the patriciate to confront a reality that legal formalism had long obscured. Rome could not function without the plebs. The result was a compromise unprecedented in Roman history. The plebeians returned, but only after the creation of an entirely new office, the tribune of the plebs. This was not a magistracy in the traditional sense. It was not derived from royal precedent, nor ratified by patrician structures. It was a parallel institution, born from plebeian initiative and protected by a new kind of legal authority, sacrosanctitas. Tribunes could not be harmed. Their persons were inviolable. This protection was not symbolic. It was religious and contractual. Anyone who laid hands on a tribune committed a sacred crime. But the tribunes did not merely stand apart. They stood in opposition. Their principal power was intercessio, the right to veto. Any act by a patrician magistrate could be stopped by a tribune's intervention. And more critically, the tribune could shield any plebeian from coercion, acting as a constitutional protector where none had existed before. Mommsen stresses the novelty of this moment. For the first time, Rome had two centers of authority operating within the same civic structure. The patrician magistracies continued to function. The Senate remained in place. But now, parallel to them, stood an office not created by tradition, but by necessity. This was not revolution. It was legal dualism. The Roman state, rather than fracture entirely, absorbed a second axis of power. And in doing so, It set the pattern for centuries of adaptation, institutional innovation under pressure within the boundaries of form. The tribunate began not as a gesture of inclusion, but as a concession to exclusion. And from that moment forward, the plebs had not only voice, they had defense. The creation of the tribunate was not the end of reform. It was the beginning of structural transformation. With the plebeians now institutionally represented, the Roman constitution began to evolve in ways that preserved its unity while accommodating division. Mommsen emphasizes that what followed was not an abolition of patrician authority, but a gradual reconfiguration of political space. One of the most significant developments was the establishment of the comitia tributa, a new popular assembly organized not by curiae, but by tribes. Unlike the traditional comitia curiata, which was rooted in ancestral lines and religious legitimacy, the tribal assembly was organized territorially. It allowed plebeians to legislate among themselves, passing resolutions known as plebiscita. Initially, these applied only to plebeians. But over time, the very act of legislating outside the patrician system marked a profound shift. Law was no longer the exclusive domain of aristocratic ritual. It was becoming the expression of collective civic will. This movement was further supported by the creation of aediles, plebeian magistrates who oversaw markets, public order, and religious festivals within the plebeian community. Though subordinate to the tribunes, they represented a new layer of administrative capacity within the plebeian order. The plebs were not merely protecting themselves, they were building parallel institutions. Mommsen interprets these developments as a partial duplication of the state within the state. The patricians still controlled the highest offices of imperium, still presided over the Senate, still governed the army and foreign affairs. But they no longer governed alone. The reformed constitution, as it took shape, was not the product of a single event. It was a series of accommodations, tested in conflict, ratified in practice, and formalized in custom. It represented an extraordinary constitutional innovation, a dual political order functioning within one legal system. Where most ancient states would suppress opposition through force or exile, Rome legalized it. It gave the plebeians institutional space, not to destroy the state, but to engage it from within. This flexibility, Mommsen argues, was not weakness. It was design. The Roman constitution, even in its early stages, proved capable of absorbing contradiction without dissolving into civil war. It allowed the plebs to remain Roman, even while standing apart. And it laid the groundwork for the eventual unification of these dual systems into one republican order. But at this stage, the reality was clear. Rome was no longer a city of one voice. It was a city negotiating with itself, in law, in custom, and in power. Mommsen does not view the early plebeian struggle as a revolt in the modern sense, nor does he romanticize it as a triumph of democratic ideals. Instead, he frames it as something more constitutionally rare, a negotiated expansion of sovereignty within a closed system. Most ancient societies, when faced with internal divisions of this scale, either fragmented or imposed repression. But Rome, as Mommsen argues, took a different course. It absorbed contradiction through structure. It legalized opposition, and in doing so, extended the life of the state rather than compromising it. This ability, to institutionalize protest without surrendering cohesion, becomes, in Mommsen's view, one of Rome's defining strengths. The reforms born out of plebeian exclusion did not destroy the existing order. They preserved its continuity by reconfiguring its foundation. And in this process, Mommsen finds something remarkable: the Roman constitution's capacity to evolve through formal innovation rather than revolution. The tribunate was not an improvisation. It was a new office, consecrated and inviolable, inserted into the legal framework with full recognition of its distinct origin and authority. Similarly, the comitia tributa and the plebiscita were not acts of defiance. They were alternate routes to civic participation, legitimized by practice and necessity. Mommsen reads these developments not as concessions from above, but as systemic adjustments under pressure. The patricians did not yield because of generosity. They yielded because they had no choice, and because the plebeians had learned to act not just as a crowd, but as a body politic. This is the deeper insight. Rome did not overcome class conflict by dissolving it, but by embedding it within law. What emerged was a dual order that could flex without breaking, a constitutional model capable of internal conflict and still capable of enduring. Mommsen, writing in the 19th century, is conscious of the example Rome sets. A society governed not by unity of opinion, but by the resilience of its institutions. A state capable of survival not because it crushed opposition, but because it allowed opposition to exist within its very structure. In this, he sees more than historical detail. He sees a political principle, that endurance lies not in suppressing contradiction, but in mastering how to live with it. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.